Welcome to this episode of Art with Mrs. Cat. We're going to be diving into American modernism and what the American modernist art movement was. So there's a lot of components that go into this, and we're just going to be highlighting a few of those because we do not have enough time to go over all of it. But we are going to look at some highlights. We're going to look at some key artists from that time period and what created and made and fueled the American modernist movement. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so the American modernism art movement, like the modernism movement in general, it's a trend of philosophical thought, and it arises from widespread changes in culture and society with the age of modernity. So we see this happening primarily with the Industrial Revolution. When that really begins to kind of kick off, we see this new development in modernism and in this modern way of thinking about things, and it overflows into the art world. So American modernism is an artistic and cultural movement that took place in the United States beginning at the turn of the 20th century. And the core period of that is between World War I and World War II. When we get beyond that, we start looking at postmodernist. So, like its European counterpart, American modernism stemmed from a rejection of Enlightenment thinking and seeking to better represent, in a new way and this more industrialized world. So it was this, why are we painting Greek gods and these mythological, heroic stories when that has nothing to do with our lives today? And so that was kind of the thought that went behind this, both in Europe and in the United States. And that was what kind of the vehicle that fueled the American modernism movement was looking at their surroundings and going, how can I create art that has nothing to do with the people around me? I need to create art that is reflective of the world I live in, that is reflective of the culture, of the themes, of the social issues that I see around me. And I need to create artwork that is reflective of that. All right, so characteristics and influences. Modernist art has a tendency to abstraction. It's innovative, aesthetic, futuristic, and self-referential. It includes visual art, literature, music, film, design, architecture, as well as lifestyle. It reacts against historicism, artistic conventions, and industrialization of art. Art is not only to be dealt with in the in the academies, theaters, or concert halls, but it's to be included in everyday life and accessible to everyone. So these are like modern ideas that are really transforming the world of art, and we see that even happening today. Those influences and those changes that were happening over 100 years ago, we're still experiencing them today in the art world with the flood of social media and all of these things that influence us as artists and help us spread our work in a new way that we maybe weren't able to over 100 years ago. So economic and technological progress in the U.S. during the Roaring 20s gave rise to this kind of widespread utopianism, and it influenced some of the modernist artists, while others were skeptical of the embrace of technology. And that also kind of fuels artists as well. This skepticism towards, and that continues on for many decades, towards technology, the machine taking over. And so that kind of fuels this like futurism aspect of the modernist movement where, do we really trust this? And so then you have literature and all kinds of works being created that speak to that. Like, do we trust our lives to these, this technology? Is it really better for us to go this way? or is the way we've always done it better? And so there's this kind of pull between, what is the right path to take here? And you have that even in the art world. You have that, collision of ideas and collision of thought, and it being expressed through artistic means. So the victory in World War I confirmed the status of the U.S. as an international player, and it gave people self-confidence and a feeling of security. In this context, American modernism marked the beginning of American art as distinct and autonomous from European taste, by breaking artistic conventions that had been shaped after European traditions until then. American modernism benefited from the diversity of the immigrant culture that we have here in America. So artists were inspired by all these cultures that were being brought into the United States, which at this time kind of earned that nickname, the melting pot, because you had all of these cultures coming in and kind of fusing together. And so artists begin to be inspired by African, Caribbean, Asian, and European folk arts, and they embed these styles into their works. So we have all of these inspirations that are happening from these cultures that are coming into the United States and flooding into the US, that, they maybe didn't have that exposure 10, 20, 15, 50 years earlier. But this is happening, and it's fueling art, and it is also creating kind of a new type of art. And we even see that in the Harlem Renaissance and some of the other periods that we've looked at. We see these influences and this influx of influences that happens. All right, so some of the main schools and movements of the American modernism, art movement. Now, this is not all of them. This is just, kind of the highlight of the key players, so to speak. But you have the Ashcan School and American Realism. You have the Armory Show. Underneath that, you have Dada and, all of these different types of moves of art that had some influence from, Europe, but also other things as well. You have the Stieglitz group. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. You have the Arensberg Circle, the color painters, the Precisionism, the Independents, the Philadelphia School, New York Independents, Chicago, and Westward. So these are just some highlights of what was going on in this art movement. But there are like a vast number of more things that were happening within this movement. Those are just the highlights. All right, so some of the key figures we're going to talk about who are also like key figures in the American modernist movement. You have Georgia O'Keeffe, you have Arthur Dove, Aaron Douglas, who we talked about when we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, Ansel Adams and Group F64. We'll discuss that in a minute too. And Alfred Stieglitz. All right, so Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe is known as the mother of American modernism. And she, has been a major figure in American modernism since the 1920s. So, it's just phenomenal that a woman artist was kind of at the forefront of this. That was unheard of. Women were not seen. We touched on this a little bit with the Harlem Renaissance. Female artists were not really recognized during this time period. So Georgia O'Keeffe was really a pioneer. And, with her and after her, you see, like Frida Kahlo and some of those other artists that we know and recognize. But Georgia O'Keeffe was known as the mother of American modernism. She's received widespread recognition for challenging the boundaries of modern American artistic style. She's chiefly known for her paintings. She's chiefly known for her paintings of flowers, rocks, shells, animal bones, and landscapes in which she synthesized abstraction and representation. Okay, Ram's Head, White Hollyhock, and Little Hills is a well-known painting by O'Keefe from 1935. You kind of see that, over to my side over here. That's that painting that, is mentioned there. But you also see behind me, there's a landscape. She was known for her desert landscapes and her flower paintings and so forth. And then there's a portrait of her on this page as well. To go along with this lesson, there is also a podcast episode on Georgia O'Keeffe's Ram's Head, White Hollyhock, and Little Hills that you can listen to and find out a little bit more about her and about this iconic work of art from the American Modernist movement. All right, Arthur Dove. Arthur Dove, who lived from 1880 to 1946, he was an early American modernist abstract artist. He is often considered the first American abstract artist. And I've included some works up above that are just some of, the one in the center is one of his most famous ones, but just to kind of give you a taste of his style of work. That is that abstraction and, so forth that he was so well known for. He used a wide range of media, sometimes in unconventional combinations, to produce his abstractions and his abstract landscapes. Me and the Moon from 1937, that's the painting in the middle above me. This painting by Arthur Dove is a good example of his abstract landscapes, and it is considered to be the culminating work of his career. Dove did a series of experimental collage works in the 1920s, and then he experimented with techniques combining paints like hand-mixed oil or tempera over wax emulsion, and this is exemplified in Dove's painting Tanks in the collection of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. All right, Aaron Douglas. We talk about Aaron Douglas when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, but he also stands out in the crowd as an American modernist key figure. And so, while we do talk about him in the Harlem Renaissance, we do have to talk about him when we talk about the American modernist art movement. So Aaron Douglas lived from 1899 to 1979. He was an American painter, illustrator, and visual arts educator. So not only did he create, he also taught. He was a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He developed his art career painting murals and creating illustrations that addressed social issues around race and segregation in the United States by utilizing African-centric imagery. Douglas set the stage for young African-American artists to enter public arts realm through his involvement in the Harlem Artists Guild. In 1944, he concluded his art career by founding the art department at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. He taught visual art classes at Fisk until his retirement in 1966. Douglas is known as a prominent leader in modern African American art whose work influenced artists for years to come. Ansel Adams and Group F64. Ansel Adams is a personal favorite of mine, so I have to mention him. Besides the fact that he is one that we owe photography becoming an art form, he's one of the key people that was involved in developing that and, pioneering that for us. So he lived from 1902 to 1984, and he was an American landscape photographer and environmentalist. He is known for his all black and white images of the American West, and you can see some examples of that behind me. He helped found Group F64. It was an association for photographers advocating for pure photography. That was photography which favored sharp focus and the use of the full tonal range of a photograph. He and Fred Archer developed an exacting system of image making called the zone system, a method of achieving a desired final print through a deeply technical understanding of how tonal range is recorded and developed during exposure, negative development, and printing. The resulting clarity and depth of such images characterized his photography. Adams was a lifelong advocate for environmental conservation, and his photographic practice was deeply entwined with this advocacy. At age 12, he was given his first camera, and this was during a visit to Yosemite National Park. He developed his early photographic works as a member of the Sierra Club. He was later contracted with the United States Department of the Interior to make photographs of national parks. For his works and his persistent advocacy, which helped expand the national park system, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1980. Adams was a key advisor for establishing the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the MoMA, as we often refer to it, an important landmark in securing photography's institutional legitimacy. He helped stage that department's first photography exhibit. He helped found the photography magazine Aperture, and he co-founded the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona. As a photographer myself, Ansel Adams is like my hero. He is my person that I look up to in the art world. And just his work and the beauty of his black and white photographs, how they captured such depth. And, if you understand his process and the early days of how he operated, it's just phenomenal. We'll talk a little bit more about him in the future. There is also a podcast episode that goes along with this lesson that is on Ansel Adams. So make sure you take the opportunity to listen to that as we look at one of his most famous works of art from this period. So needless to say, I am passionate about Ansel Adams, and he still influences my work today. All right, another photographer who is also very key in photography being recognized as an art was Alfred Stieglitz. So he lived from 1864 to 1946. So he was a little bit ahead of Ansel Adams in age. He was honored with the Fellowship of the Royal Photographic Society, which was introduced in 1895. So when his name is mentioned, you see that little acronym after his name, the HONFRPS. So if you see that, that's what it represents and stands for. He was an American photographer and a modern art promoter, and he was instrumental over his 50-year career in making photography an accepted art form. In addition to his photography, Stieglitz was known for the New York art galleries that he ran in the early part of the 20th century, where he introduced many avant-garde European artists to the U.S. Also, a fun fact is he was married to the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. So we have a lot of portraits of Georgia O'Keeffe that were done by Stieglitz. All right, so your project, because this lesson is so big and it covers so much and there's so much content that we want to look at, we actually take 2 weeks for this lesson. And so because of that, we actually have 2 projects within this lesson. So the first project that you will do is the O'Keefe Desert Project. And you'll find out a little bit more about that on Canvas. And then the second project that we will do the second week of this lesson is the black and white photography project. So you're going to use like a phone or, whatever you have that you can take a picture with. I want you to, really look at, and I'll have some examples for you, but I want you to really look at black and white photography. And then you're going to play around with, whether it's an app or your phone where you turn it to black and white or whatever, you're going to kind of play around with doing black and white photography. So you really want to think about contrast and, all of those elements that come into play when we look at black and white photography. So you'll be doing your own black and white photography project with your phone or camera or whatever you have on hand. And there'll be more information on both of those projects on Canvas. So make sure you check that out. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope you really enjoyed learning about American modernism. Obviously, this is like a crash course on American modernism because American modernism covered many decades. And honestly, it's still going on today. So there's no way for us to capture all that American modernism as an art movement encompasses, but this was a way we could kind of do that in at least a little highlighted portion to highlight the important foundational parts of American modernism. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you next time on Art with Mrs. Cap.